This episode of the Coffee with Philosophers podcast, I'm honored to have on Dr. Jim Sterba to discuss his new debate book with Richard Swinburne. It's titled, Could a Good God Permit So Much Suffering? It's an excellent book, and I really think it puts the logical problem of evil back on the table. That, coupled with his earlier book as well, this is an excellent book that is very relevant to what we're going to discuss today. Is a good God logically possible? He's published many books and many articles, so I won't go over them, but you can get him, check him out online. He's professor of philosophy at Notre Dame. And if you watch to the end of this video, you're going to understand the key points of disagreement between Richard and Jim. And then you're going to also discover Jim's new streamlined version of his argument, which he's still working on. So you're kind of going to get an inside scoop into the latest version of his argument. Jim, thank you for coming on the Coffee with Philosophers podcast.
Welcome to be here.
Now, I always ask a 5 books question. So what 5 single volume books would you bring to a deserted island if you knew you were going to be stuck there alone for 10 years?
Well, that's hard to say, but let me just throw 5 out there. So John Rawls' Theory of Justice, John Rawls' Political Liberalism, and then I guess my last, well, there's 2 out now, and there's a third one coming. Well, I'll be submitting it to publishers soon. So 3 books on the problem of evil, on the logical argument from evil. So the new one it goes to this more streamlined version of the logical argument, but then it has responses to more than 50 critics. So that's the new book.
Oh, wow. So you're working on it as we speak.
And if I get on this deserted island, wherever you're putting me for what's it, 10 years, I can think about those arguments.
That's good. And Rawls. I personally love Rawls. I did a lot of work on reflective equilibrium and his theory of justice. And yeah, I'm a big fan of Rawls as well. So
I did my dissertation on Rawls.
Oh, cool. All right. So we'll start out by just kind of contrasting what's in the current book that's about to be released, your debate book with Richard Swinburne, and then we can discuss your sort of streamlined version. So in the book with Richard, you offer like a full 4-fold distinction between first-order goods, second-order goods, and goods we have a right to and goods we don't. Now, you've simplified your argument, and in email correspondence, you said, now I'm simply claiming that all the goods that God could provide us are either goods that logically depend on God's permission of horrendous evil consequences, or goods that do not logically depend on God's permission of horrendous evil consequences. So before we look at the principles, I thought it'd be good to just understand, what does it mean for goods to logically depend on God's permission of such evils versus those that don't? And maybe you could give us some examples.
Well, the theist is always talking about goods that logically depend on God's permission of evil. So that it's just a basic assumption of both theists and atheists in this game. So what does that mean? It means that, let me give an example. An example would be, so you have someone commits a horrendous rape. Well, there is a good of consoling the rape victim. That good is logically connected to the existence of the rape and God's permission of that rape. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. I think we could, that intuitively people kind of understand that. There are goods that don't depend logically on God's permission of horrendous evil. For example, his offering of friendship to us. It can't be that God is constrained to permit horrendous evil before he can offer us friendship. I mean, we could offer friendship to other people without first permitting horrendous evil. Surely God can do that. So there's lots of goods that aren't logically dependent on God's permission of horrendous evil, and then there are the goods that are logically connected to God's permission of horrendous evil.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. And then another clarification, why not just say horrendous evils? So what work is the consequences bit doing? And then also relatedly, what qualifies as especially horrendous evil consequences?
Well, actually, this goes to the history of the debate book with Swinburne, and actually other discussions I had with William Hasker. Well, here's the point. One of the things I'm talking about what God should prevent, and I don't want him to prevent. I mean, if you're thinking about doing something horrendous evil, just think about how we think about a political state. The political state doesn't prosecute us for simply thinking about killing somebody, an innocent person. I mean, something has to happen. I mean, we have to make plans, and then we have to take steps. And then if the state can get in there and see us taking the steps, boom, boom, it comes in there and tries to stop us. Sometimes it doesn't. Can't get there, and it only can react to our act. So the political state, the inner act, I mean, the thought is not the thing we're going to try to stop. We're going to have people have the freedom in the state, and I think God would want this too if he existed, freedom to think things out, make that inner choice, and then maybe start planning. And then what the real problem is when it starts coming down on other people, and innocent people. That's where you want to stop to happen. I mean, for a state and I'm saying for God. So that's why I'm focusing on the consequences, not the inner act, because I think that should be free territory. If we're talking about how much freedom should individuals have, they should have the freedom for those inner acts. The problem is only when their outer acts bring down horrendous consequences on people, that's when we want to say, oh, if we could prevent that, that's what we want to prevent.
I see. Okay. And so one other question I have is, when do we say the horrendous evil consequences start in particular actions? So let's say I randomly decide to punch somebody. Horrible, I know. But let's imagine I do that, and it actually becomes a dragged out fight, and I end up killing the person. But after the first punch, we wouldn't want to say I've inflicted horrendous evil consequences. Let's just say, and this kind of continues. My question is whether there's like problematic vagueness in sort of demarcating the imposition of the horrendous evil consequences. Maybe it's just right before death, or maybe it's death or after his death. And so I'm just wondering, I know we're going to use big examples like the Gulag or the Holocaust, but I'm also wondering just how do we demarcate when the horrendous evil consequences start?
I don't think much about that. I really don't think because that's not really an issue. But everybody realizes there's some horrendous evil consequences that happen in our world. And you mentioned you could talk to Holocaust, you could Gulag. These are horrendous consequences. Exactly how far could Hitler have gone before he started into the horrendous consequence? I mean, who cares in a way? We know he went all the way. And we're worrying about it. And you might say maybe it's just when he started dragging Jews out of their other homes and started bring them down to the train station to then go on to Auschwitz. I mean, but that point of just exactly when was it something less and when was it something more, that's not really an issue because we know that there's a lot of the more. We're convinced that the horrendous evil consequences have happened. Nobody's doubting. I mean, in the argument with the between the theist and the atheist, there's the problem of evil. There's some givens. One of the givens that the atheist gives the theist is there's an all good, all powerful God, just by assumption. And then another thing that's common is that the horrendous evil actions that God permits. That's kind of a given. And then the question is, are there some moral principles that would, taking those principles into account, given an all-good, all-powerful God, and given the horrendous evil in the world, that would make it impossible for a God to permit that horrendous evil? So the debate is about the principles that come in there. Like in Mackey's argument, that's what Plantinga attacked. He didn't attack the assumption there was all good, powerful God. He didn't attack the assumption there was evil in the world. He went after they have to be necessary principles, and Mackey tried for something wasn't very good. Pratica just ran a truck over it. And then nobody did anything for 50 years. Because they
I know. And then till you came back.
That's only because I was a moral and political philosopher working in the wilderness there, paying no attention to the problem of evil. And then I just, I'm in Notre Dame, so I'm looking around there having problem evil conferences, and I'm right next to the Philosophy and Religion Center. I mean, eventually I can see what I could see is that these people working on the problem of evil were mostly not moral and political philosophers. They were logicians, metaphysicians, and then I think, well, and then I was getting to a point in my career, well, I didn't know what I was going to do next. So then I had this idea of bringing moral and political philosophy to bear on the problem of evil. And I took that idea to the Templeton people. I didn't know where it was going to go. And they thought it was interesting because that's the problem. People work on the problem of evil hadn't been doing focus that way. And so we got the Templeton conferences, and they started me thinking on this. And we are where we are.
Okay, that's helpful. And just to kind of go back, so the reason I asked the question about demarcation, I understand your point. Look, everyone agrees there's these horrendous acts and horrendous evil consequences. That's just constitutive of the debate that we assume that these things have happened. But why I mentioned it is because it's going to become relevant with your discussion with Richard, because he's going to focus a little bit on what he calls significant evils that stop short of horrendous evils, and use that as leverage to then make a point about the horrendous evils. So that's why I was sort of wondering, can we cleanly demarcate these?
When that happens, that part of the debate, what Richard is going to compare, is going to compare something like what the Nazis were doing to their inmates at Auschwitz. So the unequal freedom between the Nazis and the inmates. And then he's going to compare this to what a good parent might do with respect to their children. So the parent allows some equal freedom, and then the Nazis had this great unequal freedom. And and the argument's going to be something. So, I mean, it's not going to get at the fringes here. It's the parent, those very innocent things, and then what the Nazis were doing. So we're not at the margins. We're at the extremes.
Okay. Well, we'll keep that in mind. And right now, why don't we go ahead and get the principles on the table? And in particular, this is your streamline principle, what you call moral evil prevention requirement. That's MEPR alpha. And could you just briefly kind of talk us through that one?
Well, look what it says. It says, do not secure a good by permitting especially horrendous evil consequences when you can easily secure the same good without permitting horrendous evil consequences. No, you did ask about this especially. Let me say just something about that. I'm not sure that we should just be concerned about horrendous consequences. That's why I said especially, because I think I'm making the argument go through for the thing that there's less doubt about this, that a state or God maybe should be concerned about horrendous consequences. When you get to the lesser things, that's where this whole point about freedom. Well, it's not one of these very serious things. It's something lesser. And so what happened was, this is with the debate with William Hasker earlier, a discussion with Hasker has an argument that if God were to permit or prevent evil, we would be in a moral kindergarten.
That's right. Yeah.
So Hasker was raising the kindergarten objection. Now, I initially had that God should be preventing significant and horrendous. I had significant and horrendous in the principles.
Okay.
And so, and I kept saying, well, but still there's a problem here. Hasker kept coming back. It's a moral kindergarten. So then what I did, I dropped out the significant. I just said, let's focus on the horrendous. If God is messing up with horrendous, that's enough. I mean, that's not mess up everything. You don't have to prove he messes up with everything, just the horrendous. And Hasker stopped. No more problem. Because why is that? If God would prevent the horrendous evil consequences, but not the significant, we could still have a challenge to deal with significant evil in the world. No, God was not going to touch that significant evil. If it was going to be prevented, we had to prevent it. So that's where we could have the morality going on. And here's just another. This is an analog to what a just state tries to do. It doesn't say, citizens, you're on your own. Deal with the murderers. Deal with the rapists. We're going to stand back and not do anything. No, the state gets in there and tries to prevent horrendous evil as much as it can without taking away too much freedom. And citizens want that. They want the state to be controlling bad people. And so that's why you want to focus on the horrendous part, because that's what both the state is trying to prevent, and then the argument is, well, God maybe should do it when the state can't. And that's my argument. So that's
okay.
The way the thing moves there. Yeah.
Okay. And then Richard's going to come back, which we'll get to later, and say, well, God, as a good benefactor, has even more right to allow more significant harms on individuals, because unlike a state only has a limited scope of practice, so to speak, or jurisdiction, parents have a even more limited scope, or vice versa. They have different rights to impose harms on individuals. And then, but God, who is so much greater and has so much more knowledge, has even a greater scope of permission
What I don't understand is, I actually made an argument in the book why that assumption is wrong. You can't make that assumption. And Richard does not address it. Why God can't be assumed to be this super benefactor, given what we know. And I don't understand why he never came at that. I just don't. He came back on some things. He didn't come back on that.
Okay. Maybe we can address that as we get further along.
Yeah.
So let's do, this kind of becomes the crux of the debate, because this is really similar to the principle in the book called MEPR 2, but you've sort of created a streamlined version you call beta. Could you talk us through this one, and maybe also how it relates to what people will find in the book?
Okay, let me just go back to, you asked me about the first principle. I mean, I think it's a no-brainer. I mean, it says, look, if you can get a certain good without permitting horrendous evil, then get it that way. Don't get it by permitting horrendous evil. I mean, it's just, why would you bring evil into the world to get a good when you can get the good without it? So that's, I think, the first principle is no-brainer. And Swinburne agrees with me on the first principle. Now, on this principle. So what's the idea here? Well, let me give you an example to show what's going on with this principle. Again, let's do the Holocaust, and let's do a figure in the Holocaust was introduced to me by Ed Fazer. It's Maximilian Kolbe. Maximilian Kolbe was a Jesuit priest. He was in Auschwitz, and some inmates had tried to escape. And then the Nazis did what they do. They went to the population of inmates and said, "All right, we're going to kill 20 of you because 2 inmates tried to escape." And then so they were automatically selecting people. And what happens is one guy is going to be selected, and he yells, "I got a wife." I mean, at this point, people were getting out of Auschwitz. I have a wife and children. Because if you get selected, you weren't immediately killed, but you were put into some place and basically starved to death. Maximilian Kolbe volunteers. He says, "I'll take the guy's place," and he does. And he's taken off to this place, and he didn't actually die of starvation. They left him in there for so long, and then he and a couple others were still alive, and then I guess, gave him an injection after that. So he did die, but not from starvation. So now that was a very courageous act, and of course it could not have happened without the Holocaust. And that it was all part of. He was Auschwitz, and so his act was logically necessary, connected to the existence of the Holocaust. Now, what I'd say is that. Maximilian Kolbe was willing to make this sacrifice of himself, and it was a very courageous act. But he also had, I'm thinking, or should have had, a moral preference. And the moral preference was that God would prevent the Holocaust, and then, of course, I won't have do this virtuous act. I would prefer that God prevent the Holocaust and give up this virtuous act that I made, which goes to my honor and everything. But the prevention of the Holocaust is a greater good, and so that's what I prefer. And then I'm thinking that's Maximilian Kolbe's thinking, and then I'm thinking, well, then God should, yes, Maximilian Kolbe rightly has that moral preference. I should act on it and prevent the Holocaust if I'm all good and all powerful. And that's basically another way of putting my argument right there. Using this principle, that's why, see, Maximilian Kolbe morally prefers, because it's a greater good to have the Holocaust prevented than he have this virtuous act of courageous act. And he morally prefers that. And God, knowing that that would be his moral preference, should have acted to prevent the Holocaust. And Maximilian Kolbe would go on and do other kinds of virtuous act, but not have the opportunity for this very courageous act in which he dies. So maybe that explains how I think the principle works. You see, let me do one more thing. So if God had prevented all the horrendous evil in the world, then there would a couple things would have happened. We would all have equal opportunity for soul making, because you see what happens. Here's the problem with horrendous evil. It happens in the Holocaust. It happens elsewhere. There's a perpetrator of horrendous evil, and then there's the victim. They obviously don't have equal freedom. If you give, the perpetrator is allowed to do it and not stopped, he will exercise freedom, and the victim almost has no freedom, has something but very little. So there's no equal opportunity for soul making when you're allowing horrendous evil perpetrators to commit horrendous evil. They take away the freedom of others, and they have just too much freedom themselves. Now, a state recognizes this and tries to control the would-be perpetrators, to limit their freedom so that ordinary citizens can have more freedom to act virtuously. We're more or less successful in this. God, of course, if he was there to help out in this process, could make us all successful. So we would have greater equal opportunity for soul making. We would also have, because of horrendous evils prevented, a decent resources for a decent life, and then there wouldn't be horrendous evil in the world. So those are the three things happen if God would prevent the horrendous evil. If he permits it, you have inequality of opportunity of soul making. You don't have some people don't have a decent minimum, and there's horrendous evil. But you get one other thing: you get these opportunities that Maximilian Kolbe had, and all other people to react to the horrendous evil in the world, and maybe be virtuous. But my claim is those people, it would still, even though they'll act virtuous, some will and some won't. The ones that act virtuous, and maybe all of them, thinking about it carefully, would morally prefer that God had prevented the horrendous evil than that they had permitted it, and they have these possibilities for virtuous act. The prevention of horrendous evil is a much greater good than their virtuous acts of resisting evil in their lives. They know that. I would know that. If I was Maximilian Kolbe, yeah, I'll be courageous, hopefully. But if I could have my preference, I would want the Holocaust to be prevented. That would be a much greater good. When you have this, the second principle here deals with, see, in the first principle, there was no logical connection between the good and the horrendous evil. You could get the good without the horrendous evil. No logical connection. In this situation, there is a logical connection between the good of what goods? The good of Maximilian Kolbe's courageous act and the permission of the horrendous evil. So there is a logical connection here. But what I'm saying is the beneficiaries of the good, of God's permission of horrendous evil, the Maximilian Kolbes of the world, would morally prefer that God had prevented the horrendous evil and they would no longer have this good. They don't need that good to be. They could still be friends with God without that good. They could still have a whole way to be virtuous that would just be, they and bad people would be somewhat constrained in how much bad they could do in order to create an opportunity environment.
So I think, well, I'll jump ahead as well. So there's no worries. We're just kind of free floating, but that was a great explanation of sort of the whole big picture of your argument. So I think one point that Richard would make here is there's a difference between soul making and saint making. Now, Maximilian Kolbe wasn't just forming his character. Richard might say he did a greater good of becoming a saint, willingly sacrificing his life for another. Now, so he might say the relevant contrast is not between the Holocaust versus soul making. The relevant contrast is between the Holocaust versus saint making. And he might argue, as I think he does in the book, God doesn't just want us to be good people. God wants us to be sort of the ultimate sort of people, like attain to sainthood if we can. And so he might say that that's the relevant contrast. And given that, if we balance the opportunity for saint making versus the opportunity for versus the horrendous evil consequences of the Holocaust, I think Richard's going to say God should allow that, give us the freedom to sort of become the sort of people we can become, either for the good or for the bad by our choices. Kolbe chose the good and chose like the ultimate act of sacrificing himself for another, laying down his life for another. And given that, it becomes less clear that Kolbe's preference would have been, hey, prevent the Holocaust, and even if that means it's not possible for anyone to become a saint, because sainthood requires like sacrifice in the midst of horrendous evil.
So I agree that Richard brings out this opportunity to be a saint. But see, what he's imagining there is you must have the opportunity to be a saint or a villain, a terrible villain. You have to have the freedom to go either way. And he imagines, okay. And so when you think about the Holocaust situations, the only one that it closely has the freedom to go every way, but maybe the prison guards, maybe. They can either, I don't know, give up, run off, stop doing their guard duty, and or they could carry out and do the horrendous deals. The inmates have no freedom to go either way. I mean, their freedom is terribly restricted. So yes, the opportunity that he's imagining to be a saint, you have to be able to do horrendous evil and horrendous glorious good. But the problem is you can't give everybody that, because if somebody's got this ability to do horrendous evil and horrendous good, or terrific good, and they do the horrendous evil, then they take away other people's opportunity to have that thing. You can't all have equal freedom to do horrendous evil and horrendous good. That's what the whole political idea of a state. One was a political philosopher here. The state comes in and restricts everybody's freedom. And that restricted freedom is a better way to live together than just be in the state of nature with boom, 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 boom. I mean, that's horrible. Some people could do great virtue there, but when the people do great vice, other people don't even have the chance to do great virtue anymore. They're crushed. So that's why, yes, he has this be a saint. But you can't. Maximilian Kolbe really didn't have a freedom to do both things. He wasn't free to do very much evil there, and he did have this freedom to sacrifice. That was about all he had. He didn't have the freedom to stop the Holocaust. Well, he would have done that if he could. God had that, and that's why his moral preference was with God. So Maximilian Kolbe was not in a situation of having great freedom. He only had one thing he could do, which was a great thing he did, but a lot of things he couldn't do. The only one that was really had most like Swinburne's model is the villains in these things. They have the freedom to go good or bad. But then when they go bad, other people don't have the freedom. And not have equal freedom. They don't have equal freedom.
Okay, I see. So you're saying that what really matters is the freedom to how much freedom you have. And soul making requires a certain level of freedom.
Right.
And to go good or evil. And so if God were to prevent these horrendous evil consequences, that would I guess level the playing field a little bit.
Yeah, and other people, everybody would have about equal freedom to do good or bad. What you want, see, is a world where, again, it's a political ideal here. Everybody has equal freedom. If you have some people doing horrendous evil, they take away, the other people can't have equal freedom anymore. They've crushed them. So you have to constrain the horrendous part. That's what a state tries to do, a good state. And even the good people in it. Think about the good people who would not do a bad thing. They would rather have themselves constrained on condition that the bad people are constrained, and that they're all operating under a constrained ability to do good and evil. And that is a better world to live in, because people will still do bad things to other people, but it won't crush them, and they could come back out, and people have then the opportunity to be good and bad to some extent, and that's the way we want the game of life to go. That's fair to everybody.
Okay, now this I have a few other thoughts. One is about Marilyn McCord Adams' defeat condition.
Yeah.
So I that's what I was about to go into, but we can sort of table that or discuss that now, whatever you prefer. But I was thinking, God allows this freedom to go either way. And even if people freely choose to make themselves the villain, we still have the afterlife. You're talking about a political ideal. The afterlife is the ultimate political ideal of justice being served, both desert and reward, right? So if we're sticking with this theistic model, so I think Richard does kind of bring that in as well, that in the afterlife, God can offer and compensate and make up for the horrendous evil consequences that a person suffered in this life, and also can exact justice on those who chose to exercise their freedom that they were given in an irresponsible way that harmed others significantly or horrendously. So what about the afterlife piece that can sort of reconcile why God would allow these horrendous evils on earth, even though it means, as you suggest, there's maybe a more imbalanced playing field for soul making? Right.
See, this is important. In the debate between the atheist and the theist, I mentioned before that the atheist gives the theist a hypothesis of an all-good, all-powerful God, and then they both agree on that there's horrendous evil in the world. There's another thing that I do here, and I don't think Michael Tooley does this. Maybe others do it. Maybe not. I give the theist the assumption of an afterlife, because I think without the afterlife, it's going to be very, very hard to argue for theism. But I'm going to give the assumption there, and so and there's more. It may be relevant to Marilyn Adams. We could talk about another assumption I might give the theist. But here in afterlife, sure. But the problem is here's the problem. In this life, we have these two constraining principles about permitting horrendous evil. One, don't permit horrendous evil to get a good when you could get the good without. Now, suppose God permitted horrendous evil to get a good, that would be horrible. I mean, he couldn't do anything in the afterlife to make up for that, because that would be a terrible mistake that in this life that we would experience, and he should never have done in this life. And so the afterlife is not going to be any way to fix that. It's a mistake. It should never have been made in this life. anytime God permits evil in this life, it has to be to create a greater good in the afterlife. But there's nothing when he could, all the goods that he was going to give in the afterlife, he could give them, and he didn't have to permit horrendous evil to get this good because he could have got it without in this life. So it was a mistake in this life. Nothing in the afterlife would ever rectify that kind of mistake if God made it.
Okay, that's your first principle, which Swinburne's going to grant. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But now let's look at the second one. In the
Second one, yeah.
So what you have here, my claim, is the beneficiaries of these goods that of permitting horrendous evil would morally prefer that God had not permitted the horrendous evil, and they don't, because they don't need those goods. They could have an opportunity to be friends with God in the afterlife. That's not one of the goods that's connected to the evil. The only thing that's connected to the horrendous evil is here. Well, they could, console the rape victim. Well, that's a virtue. They like that, but they would much prefer that there'd been no rape, and then it could go on and be virtuous in some other way. Again, it's back to the Max and Kolbe thing. All the other things are like Max and Kolbe's acts. If Maxim and Kolbe could be understood to morally prefer that he didn't have this virtue, the virtuous act, but he give it up, and the horrendous evil of in the world would be not there, and then an equal opportunity for soul making would be there, because horrendous evil is always messing up the equal opportunity. That would be Maxim and Kolbe's preference. Now, in the afterlife, now let's go back. If God doesn't act on Maxim and Kolbe's preference here, can he make up for it in the afterlife? Well, I don't know why. I mean, why would... Here's what he ought to do in this life. He ought to listen to Maxim and Kolbe. He doesn't want the good you're giving him. He wants a greater good. And you say, no, I'm going to give you this lesser good, and then I'll fix it in the after. That is not what a moral being can do. We can't do that. We can't, do something horrible to somebody in this life and say, oh, yeah, well, and then later, I don't know, maybe later in our life, fix it up. No, it was a big mistake. We could be sorry we made this mistake, but we still don't come out an all good being having made that mistake. That will always be a blemish on us. Even how much we would regret it, it would still be a blemish on us. That's why I'm saying the perpetrators, if they ever morally understood the situation, they would morally prefer that God had prevented the horrendous evil than they have the freedom to impose evil on their victims. That was, when they think morally about it, that was not something they needed.
Unless the perpetrators are so evil, because we're talking about horrendous evil, okay. Unless the perpetrators are so evil that their preferences are so distorted by their evil that even in the afterlife, they would still prefer that God had allowed them to perpetrate the horrendous evil. So what would you say about that? Like people who are just, I was watching a special on Jeffrey Dahmer. Yeah. Don't watch it. But anyway, you just briefly, I couldn't actually watch the whole thing. It was so disturbing, as you know.
A preference. But see, I don't know what you're going to do. I mean, what we're thinking about is about people that could be moral or not. I'm not sure Jeffrey Dahmer is one of those. If he's operating in some very strange vision of his role in life and compared to, he's not thinking about anybody he's not thinking morally at all. So we have to have something, get this thing going. We have to, and some people are like that, and some people, minds, they can't do moral acts or immoral acts. I mean, well, what's going to happen with those people, But I think that the one the kind of person we're focused on is somebody who's capable of doing moral things and capable of doing immoral things. If somebody's just destined to be horrendously evil, that's not even a moral person. It's not an immoral person. He's sort of like a tiger, a wild animal that can do nothing but something horrible to at least to humans, and no morality.
Yeah, well, I think that's an interesting point, but I think actually the Dahmer point illustrates the opposite. So what was interesting is they were interviewing him right before another inmate killed him. And so this interview took place, like, I don't know, he had been in jail for a while, and he didn't necessarily have full-blown remorse, but he didn't want to do those things anymore. He recognized how bad it was. And he even said in the interview, I deserve death for the things I've done. So maybe that's an implicit remorse. And so then he said, I still have the desires come up from time to time, but I have no impulse to act on them. Now we take Jeffrey Dahmer into the afterlife, and I think that's going to be even more so the case. He will be a moral agent. He will, but he still may be so distorted that he looks back and says, even though I don't want to do that now, I'm glad I was able to do that. But it isn't like he's still going to be, obviously perpetrating that, but he's still a moral agent. He's not just a caged animal, as you were suggesting.
Well, there's another version that's one version of this, just impetus to evil. But there's another version of what's going wrong in some people is that they have no sympathy for others. I mean, when they're thinking about doing killing them or raping them or something, the person's pain and suffering, that doesn't faze them at all. But see, you and I, if we ever got into this would repel us from doing bad things. So what you have here is kind of really unhinged human beings that if they can't have no reaction to the suffering of other people, they don't see it as something that is bad for them. They see, we're tortured by the badness of the suffering of other people. It bothers us. It doesn't bother some people. Biologically, it doesn't bother them. And so it's difficult to talk. I mean, we're trying to think about moral agents, and the typical moral agent is going to have these feelings, and still sometimes resist them. They'll have feelings to get revenge on somebody. So there'll be bad feelings, but we want to talk about a range of human beings, the normal range, and run the argument over that. If you get people outside the range, making an argument from them, it's hard to say what's going on. Maybe in a funny way, sad way, Dahmer really didn't commit immoral acts. He wasn't capable of committing either moral or immoral acts. I mean, there's another way to think about that. I don't know. I don't know these cases. We should have watched this together.
Well, why? Let me say why I brought it up, because just going back to Maximilian Kolbe, when you were talking about would he prefer to not have the opportunity to become a saint versus the opportunity for it to not even be a possibility because there's no Holocaust, I was thinking the relevant contrast is not between the whole Holocaust versus that particular opportunity for saint making. I was thinking the opportunity or the relevant contrast is, would I have morally preferred that person had not been almost killed and then given me then the guards gave me the opportunity to stand in their place. And why I ask, because if you go for the whole Holocaust as the contrast, then we're talking about Hitler. And then I think we're talking about Dahmer. You see that? Well, I don't. A Dahmer type situation, like Hitler was so evil, like he might have been Jeffrey Dahmer on steroids. And so now we're not even talking about a moral, there's individual players in the Holocaust that did horrendous evil. But yeah.
The idea, in Swinburne's understanding, it's not clear that Maximilian Kolbe had the opportunity to be a saint. I mean, when way Swinburne understands sainthood is you have the opportunity to do horrendously evil thing or horrendously very good thing. And that the only one that really has that is the perpetrators of the evil. the people that are already crushed by or limited by the perpetrators, like Kolbe, his freedom is not much at all. I mean, he saw this good act, self-sacrifice. It really, still one person dies. He dies, and the other guy doesn't die. Okay, it was a nice act of friendship, and that's why it was recognized. But it wasn't. He didn't have a way of stopping the Holocaust. He couldn't do that. He could only stop a little bit of it in its effect in his context. So, and we still call him a saint. But the way Swinburne's using that, because he doesn't want God to prevent any horrendous evil, he's trying to give us the big choice. And saints are supposed to have the big choice. So he's almost imagining there's no state. And we're all kind of in the state of nature. And now we could do as much evil as we can do, and we can do as much good as we could do. But see, that situation, everybody can't be in that. Once the evildoers start doing evil, they restrain the freedom of the others. And so those individuals no longer have equal freedom to do good and do bad. Kolbe didn't have equal freedom, the same freedoms to do good and bad as the prison guard. He had much more constrained freedoms to do good and bad. And he exercised, within that constraint, a pretty nice choice. And that's why we honor him. But it's not like he had equal freedom. He didn't. The prison guard had much more freedom, and he fouled up. And what we want to do, I think the state wants to do, and God should want to do, is when people foul up that way, we don't have to give them their full freedom. We can stop them before the act comes down. Let them plan. You can imagine Hitler with his black shirts. They're planning what they're going to do with the Jews, they're making all these plans, and then they go out and try to do it. And you can't get them down to the train station. Well, there it is. They exercise their freedom to do a certain degree, but we weren't going to give them the freedom to put those Jews into the trains to Auschwitz. And if we could do that, we would do it. And of course, God certainly could do it. And the idea is, well, why shouldn't it be done then? Why are we letting this happen? Setting up an unequal freedom that we can never, back to your point, never rectify in the afterlife, because it's an unequal freedom that we should have never allowed to exist in this life, because it wasn't necessary for the good of any individual. They could have friendship with God without that Holocaust. They could have equal opportunity for soul making without that Holocaust, and it just wasn't something. If you had the power to do it, you would let in play, because it's not good for the people involved, either the perpetrators or the victims.
Okay. So I think would be good to touch on that point that you mentioned Swinburne failed to address. Yeah. And let me sort of set that up by going back to the saint making point.
Sure.
And actually pull a quote from Richard. So he says, basically, this is just a paraphrase initially, God allows such victims of horrendous evils to suffer, even to have their freedom limited, because having such freedom makes possible the highest form of character development, saint making. As Swinburne says, quote, but he has not taken Sterba has not taken my point that God is concerned, not merely that we have a decent life, but that we should have the life of saints, and that if we deal with horrendous evils correctly, we shall become saints by our own free choice. And as I've argued, he's quoting himself, only saints would be happy living the life of heaven everlasting. That is the sort of soul making, not Sterba's low-grade soul making, which we need for our ultimate well-being. And then he continues, many of us have the opportunity to do very good acts of actions of courageously bearing and helping others, to courageously bear natural evils of disease, accident, and the weakness of old age, as well as moral evils inflicted on us by others. But doing such ordinary, very good acts may still leave us with selfish desires to which we're tempted to yield. then coping in the best way with horrendous evils, for example, by allowing oneself to be killed by a painful process in order to save the lives of others, will surely finally make us saints. To be allowed to suffer for a good cause has been recognized in many cultures as a privilege, and it is surely a great good for us that we have the opportunity to suffer for a very good cause, and thereby to make ourselves saints by our own free choice. And being available to suffer such evils does not merely provide the sufferer with a great choice of how to deal with them, but it provides the perpetrators with the good of the final choice of their own destiny. End quote. So how might you respond to some of that?
Well, look, let me run it this way. Richard agrees that the state and individuals should do all they can to prevent horrendous evil consequences. This is what they should do. They should not let them happen, the consequences happen, and so people can suffer them and somehow suffer them well. I'm not sure what that's going to mean. They should be preventing. We all have this moral obligation. The state has a moral obligation to prevent horrendous evil consequences. And the question is, what if the state were very successful at this? So it prevents horrendous evil consequences. We have significant evil, and we have some good acts and bad acts run out in that. Is that bad? Is that if that's actually what the state should do, and we're successful? I raised this point about if we're successful, and then Swinburne said, well, maybe they'll be successful in the society, but then there's the natural evil. How they going to control the horrendous? And then he even imagines. He says, well, what if they develop ways of preventing natural evil too? So now we're in a situation where we prevented horrendous evil, social action, moral evil, and prevented horrendous natural evil. And then he says, now he then compares that state to the state we're in, which we certainly don't have all the moral evil prevented, and we certainly don't have the natural evil prevented. And then he says, well, the current state is not, I'm not claiming that, what I'm claiming is there's nothing wrong with the current state, even though maybe this other state would be better. He tries to, because I pushed him. What if in the state everybody does everything? Then you know what? No role for God anymore.
Yeah, and just to jump in, he says on that point, he says, I'm not saying that this world is better. I'm just saying it's not worse.
Yeah, but I'm saying it is worse. Why?
Okay, yeah, right. So that's your...
It is worse. Why is it worse? Compare our world to the world where all horrendous evil and horrendous natural evil is prevented. And we live our lives with significant evil, and we do good and bad to people, but nobody is knocked down and no longer moral agents. They're all still, even though they suffer some significant evils, they still are functioning human beings. And so they go, and we live that way, and we're virtuous or vicious in those constraints. Just the constraints that the political state wants. That's a better way to live than the way we're living now. This is not good. Wars, all those people killed in Gaza, all those people killed in Ukraine. This is not that a world where all that was constrained by human beings would be a much better. It would be. This is worse than that. This world is worse than that. So he's just wrong about that final conclusion. And so I think this gets back to his good benefactor conditions. Good.
Yeah, so I think what he's going to say, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm definitely not Richard Swinburne, but I'm just trying to remember what his kind of thrust was. But I think he's going to say, you're imagining a world, you're imagining that this world with all the horrendous evil is a world such that God is no longer a good benefactor.
Yes.
Because he's allowing all this horrible stuff, And the good benefactor condition is that God on the whole makes your life good. All things equal, so to speak. You might have a horrendous evil like period of time, but then if we look like a child who dies early in their life is horrible, they suffer all this horrendous evil, they die, but then they have the afterlife. And so God would still be a good benefactor on the whole for their life.
Just one thing about the child, just a minute for a child. When that happens, the child, and maybe imagine children that are, less than 5 or 6 or 7, and they're not moral agents yet. They now what happens in an afterlife? Somehow they've got another parallel world has got to be created where they grow up to be moral agents and have choices. They just don't get a free pass in heaven. We're supposed to be struggling between good and evil. They don't struggle between good and evil. Something's going to be just as good. Now we got parallel worlds going on in order to give them the opportunity to engage in soul making. That's the only way it makes sense. If they get a free pass in the heaven, then that's terrible. There's an interesting fellow. He's an atheist actually now, but as a boy he grew up in under Islam. And in Islam there is this. They're thinking about this condition. And if you die before you're 7 or 8, you go to heaven. There's it's. And so what he did is he jumps off a big building, trying to kill himself before he reaches this age, because he was trying to get the free pass. But the free pass doesn't make sense. It all would happen is if God's going to be fair, he puts us through these trials in this life because we're around. Anybody who passes through before they became moral agents have to get a parallel world out there where they pass through trials. And you have to have good and bad people out there. It's a really complicated story about what the afterlife has to look like if God is going to be this just God. But go ahead, back to what I stopped you from going to somewhere else.
Oh, well, this is maybe what I'll do is bring up another point that wasn't in the book that I've just been thinking about. So at least in Christianity, I can't speak about Islam, the afterlife isn't this people laying on clouds, playing the flute and the lyre and, right. Is what it is there's tasks and you're given responsibility. Again, we don't know all the details, but it's not like it's just going to be this state where you're just, I don't know, in perfect ecstasy all the time, right?
Right.
So my thought is that, well, since you've granted the afterlife, we need to flesh that out a little bit. Right. And the way that we could flesh it out to make sense of why this world isn't worse than the world you're imagining, where there's no horrendous evil, is because of the connection to the afterlife and the sort of roles and responsibilities you're going to have in the afterlife, given the way you shaped your life with the significant freedom you had in this life. Now, if you had limited significant freedom, God will factor that in, like a just state, right? Like, oh, you had no control over sort of becoming this sort of person or having these harms done to you. We can factor that in terms of the sort of responsibility you're given, the role you're given in the afterlife. So what you do in this life really matters for how things play out later in the afterlife. And if God didn't give the opportunity for horrendous evil in this life, the afterlife would be the sort of vanilla life you're imagining. Not vanilla, but it would be way less interesting, and there'd be way greater responsibility. And that's a key point Richard makes, like we're given this significant responsibility to shape ourselves for good or evil to a big extent, even including horrendously and magnificently. But also it'd be the case in the afterlife that we could only have those sort of poles in the afterlife were we given that freedom to commit horrendous evils in this life.
See, we're not all given that freedom to commit horrendous evil or to do horrendous evil. That's when horrendous evil gets done, some people have great freedom, other people have no freedom. So you don't have an equal opportunity for soul making in this life unless you prevent horrendous evil. Otherwise, you've got some people with terrific freedom and other people with none. Now, if you were trying to then throw them into the afterlife, well, I don't know exactly. The whole people that had no freedom, you can't just reward them. You got to give them, it's like the children again. You got to create a situation where they have equal opportunity to be good or bad. Well, that could have been done in this life, but no, we got to do it again. We got to do it in the afterlife. So you got a real problem here. If you don't let people operate in a system with equal opportunity for soul making, you can't judge what they do as to their merit or vice. They have to have that equal opportunity. If you don't give it to them in this life, you got to do it in an afterlife. And then if you don't do it there, well, you can't make justice run over the system unless you do what the political state does: try to constrain people in this life so that they can't do horrendous evil and take away other people's basic freedoms, and they can keep basic freedom, but not at the expense of, they can't take the freedom of others away. And if they all have equal freedom, they can all then exercise soul making, and we could decide who's good and bad.
Okay, I see. And so I want to question the assumption that soul making requires equal freedom. I understand you're trying to level the playing field, and I don't want to say you're creating a socialist soul-making world, but it does. I know people have opportunity to go up or down, but it does seem you've just limited the upper and lower bounds. Is that fair?
Yeah.
In your world,
you have somebody with all the opportunity and others with no opportunity. So either if you don't put limits on the horrendous evil, you take away people don't have the same opportunities. And so you can't, I mean, look, I'm not sure which in Auschwitz, people that were just ground to dust there. Well, did they have opportunity for soul making? Very, very little choice there. They could, I don't know how they would think. It just, I mean, we have some kind of accounts of this, but it's not in any way, this is a great opportunity for soul making. It is not a great opportunity for soul making. It's certainly not an opportunity to be equally good or bad. Only the perpetrators have something like that. And that's the moral situation you're setting up, where perpetrators have greater freedom and greater opportunity, and lots of people have no freedom and little opportunity. And how do you judge the morality of what comes out of that? The thing you want to do is get that kind of arrangement out of the picture and get a situation where they have equal opportunity, so you can judge them. Just like a race, start them off equally at a starting point. Don't set some people 2 feet away from the finish line and other people way back. I mean, that's not a grace. That's not a way of judging quality or merit. You need the equal opportunity, and we try to obtain it by human means. If God were on our side here, he would be the preventer of horrendous evil of last resort, and that would make the whole system work well.
Well, and what I was going to suggest is, even with significant evils, we wouldn't have a level playing field for soul making. How would I flesh that out? Well, what is a significant evil? And this kind of gets back to why I was trying to sort of ask you if we can cleanly demarcate horrendous evil from significant evil. What is a significant evil? And isn't it the case that can create an unlevel soul-making playing field?
That's a good point. It's possible. And we do, when we think about people in ordinary life, they're not operating on an equal opportunity, even in the best states. So there is this some kind of inequality there. We're not, I mean, what the state does not try to put in place an absolute equal opportunity. I mean, it's not possible. What they're trying to do is to just get us into certain parameters where certain kinds of evils don't happen and others do, and that still creates a greater possibility of everybody having freedom, a good measure of freedom. It's not going to still be equal. The state never gets it absolutely right. And we wouldn't expect that God was helping this process to get it absolutely right either, because he's created us with different, if he created us, we have different abilities. It's just not going to create an equal opportunity. If we took all the money from the United States and distributed it all equally, it wouldn't create equal economic opportunity, because people have different educations and different smartness. Some of the people would have more money and other people less. It wouldn't be like what we have, but there's you can't equalize everything. You're just aiming to try to get it into a fair game. Look at a race. It isn't absolutely fair. It's roughly fair.
Yeah, and this may tie back into what Richard was saying about the difference between God having more rights and more abilities to allow for horrendous evil. If we're going, let's just go with your model. I think given God is so much greater than a state, he could perfectly level the playing field.
Wait a minute.
Now the worry here is if he perfectly levels the playing field, then we've lost the ability to exercise our individual capacity for significant choices, because it all has to be leveled out, and he could do that, right? And so now we're jumping back into the moral kindergarten.
Okay, watch this. So, Richard comes in with this assumption God is the super benefactor. Okay, what? I'm going to try to give Richard as much of that assumption as our. So, I think it's unclear whether we have a Big Bang, but does something cause the Big Bang? I don't know. I mean, maybe did it not have a cause? Did it have a cause? Let's assume God caused the Big Bang. Okay, so now what happens? There's this process of natural forces coming from the Big Bang up to the present, and then us. Now, think about when we make attributions of moral evil in the world. Who's the cause of moral evil? We are the primary cause of moral evil. God permits moral evil. He's not the primary cause of it. Okay, good. Who's the cause of moral good in the world? Well, by analogy, we are the cause of moral good. God permits us to do moral good. He's not the primary cause. So if we're trying to say who is the benefactor, the super benefactor of human beings, it's us, collectively, individually. We're doing the moral good if people are benefited. Not God. If anything, he's just permitting it to happen. Now, you might say, well, he's sustaining it. Okay, this is an act. But tricky here. I think what you want to say here is that he's not bringing it to an end. If he would bring us, he's supposed to be all good and all powerful. He could stop us. But that would be to do something bad to us. Typically, it means some people are ready to die. Maybe it isn't that. But what's stopping, putting end to us is and we're talking about being a benefactor here. So God not sustaining the world in this sense, putting a stop to it, would be an act of doing evil to the world, doing something bad to the world, and not an attribute of his being benefactor. So, given my analysis of moral good in the world is primarily caused by us, and given that God caused the Big Bang, okay, fine, but the benefactors there are us. Now, God could do miraculous acts and benefit us, but there's not a lot of evidence of that. So we don't have so he could be intervening miraculously. That would show that he's benefactor. But we don't have, there's not, and again, one thing about being a benefactor, his benefactors would prevent horrendous evil from coming down on your head too. Well, he's not doing that. So the idea that he's, by assumption, a benefactor here is not, well, there's no justification for that. Humans are the benefactors of other humans. God is no evidence of him in the benefacting process here if moral good is primarily caused by humans.
Okay, and I think what Richard would say,
he never
yeah, so
that's in the book.
Yeah, so you're going to just right. Okay, I see. So you're going to just say that God is not a benefactor, or there's no evidence of God being a good benefactor. So I think what Richard might say is go back to his model of parents as a good benefactor, state as a good benefactor, God as a good benefactor.
Right. Yeah.
And in the case you mentioned, you're saying God created everything. He is sustaining everything in existence. So in that sense, he's benefiting. But then it's allowing this horrible stuff to also go on, and he's not directly intervening to prevent it.
His sustaining means he just isn't. He isn't bringing it to an end. He's not
right. But Richard's point would be God has all the more right to do that as a benefactor.
Why?
Because God sees everything from the end into the beginning. Parents we only have such a limited capacity to understand things, and we should stop our children from being assaulted. The state should stop the person from trying to assassinate the president or whatever. But God, having so much more responsibility and knowledge, has a greater right to allow these things to happen and still be a good benefactor, especially in light of the afterlife.
Well, the argument that he's a benefactor hasn't been established, since we are the cause of all the moral good in the world, not God. He's a secondary cause of it. Not we are the primary cause of. Since we're the primary cause of evil in the world, moral evil, we must be primary cause of moral good. So all that moral good in the world, that's a big benefactor. It goes to us, not to God, as primary. So
okay, that I think he would object at that point and bring in some sort of moral theory according to which God actually does have is the source of all good or the ground of all good. Yeah. So even if God's not directly causing or directly, doing evil, because he wouldn't be a good God and directly do evil, he could still be the source of good, even though he's allowing people to make the choices. So God is still.
Well, you have to go. You have to go. What's the standard of morality come from? And I think even Richard would say it's not divine commands. I mean, primarily, there's a standard out there. God has to abide by the standard of goodness. He didn't make it, just like he didn't make 2 + 2 = 4. It's something, and we discover that God, in some sense, if he existed, he would know that too. He didn't make it the case. And I don't think he makes, torturing babies for the fun of it wrong. He didn't make that wrong. We discover it to be wrong. So God is in the same situation we are here, discovering good and evil. And I don't give him any credit for that. I mean, we don't get any credit for discovering good and evil. I mean, we expect it of us. I mean, go back. Yes, if you needed a cause of the Big Bang, God would be that, and then you have the natural causes coming up. But then when we get into human society, it's humans who are causing the moral good. That's where benefit is coming from. And again, think of parents. Think of parents who, the kid comes out of the womb and put him on the table. Oh, you're on your own, kid. We're not doing anything more for you. Well, that wouldn't be a real mess. That wouldn't be good parents. So even if some sense, but he only caused the Big Bang and all this natural stuff led to us, and he's not the cause of moral good. But then if he did, well, what is he doing for us now? He should be doing something, and what needs to be done is that we need somebody to prevent horrendous evil. We need that. The states are messing up on this. And if God came in there and helped us all out and helped states to become better states by his action, then that would be a big help. He did that. Wow. We recognize him. He's helped us be better with each other by setting up a framework where it enables us to be more moral than some of us would be tempted to be without the constraints. So, but that's not there.
Well, yeah, I think there's more we could say about God's goodness and being active in the world, perhaps through miracles or just perhaps through working through individuals directly. But I think it'd be good to just go back to what Richard means by good benefactor.
Yeah.
So he says, quote, a benefactor, this is his first condition, only has the right to curtail the rights of a beneficiary if the benefactor remains on balance a benefactor in providing more good than evil for the beneficiary. Now you want to say God isn't even providing the good. I think that's what you want to say.
Richard is a little bit unclear about that condition. I'm being a big benefactor, but I actually thought it was kind of low. I mean, what happens is he's a benefactor as long as you are not better off dead than alive. I mean, that's all it matters.
Right, across the whole.
And so, I mean, I don't think we would say parents are benefactors as long as they left their children better off alive than dead. I mean, they have to do a lot more than that. Now, Richard,
well, it isn't just that. It's that on the whole. So even if the parent has to allow the painful surgery to the kid, and ultimately it's going to be for the kid's good. And on the whole, the parent's going to be a good benefactor, even though they allowed them to suffer this horrendous
standard, though, that God has been judged by here. Just better off alive than dead. I mean, that I don't think that's a terribly low. Sometimes he says better off, but then I actually narrowed him down on that, and it is the one he wants is better off alive than dead, and that's a very low standard of being a benefactor. I don't think we would say that was good enough for parents or anybody.
Unless, and this kind of comes full circle, we're tying this back to the Marilyn McCord Adams point. So God again can see the start from start to finish and has knowledge we can't fathom of all the causal interactions and all the morally relevant features in play. And so given that some horrendous or horrible evil is a part of an organic whole of a person's life that is on the whole a good, then it would make sense for God as a great benefactor to allow that evil because it created it was necessary for the greater good that became their life on a whole, and that includes the afterlife. So evil is defeated, to use Adam's term, in such a person's life. And it's not just God allowing people to be better off alive than dead. It's that God allows for the evil to be part of a greater good in the person's life as a whole, such that it's not the case that their life as a whole is. Anyway, I thought there was I'll start over. I thought there was a point where you say we can't allow Adam's defeat condition to be at play here, but I think it could be used to make sense of the greater benefactor conditions. And it's not just this minimal thing, it's God's orchestrating this.
Well, the middle thing to Swinburne. I mean, but now we bring Adams in. But look, there's more to Adam's story here. It's really there's another interesting part of it that you're not giving. And this is part of her justification. So she says, look, if you're suffering this horrendous evil in this life, well, there's a benefit from you having done this in the afterlife. What's the benefit? The benefit is you will have suffered horrendous evil the way Jesus suffered horrendous evil.
Hmm.
So you have this camaraderie with Jesus in the afterlife that you would
Yeah.
not have had in this life if you had in this life you hadn't suffered horrendous evil. And now
Mm.
this objection was raised to me. It was doing an online. This was during the COVID debate at Princeton, and I can't remember now that the fellow who invited me, the person I was debating didn't do that well. I think he didn't have the standard view about God. He had God who was not a moral agent. There is
Oh, wow. Okay.
There's a whole. This is a way of trying to deal with this problem. It goes.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Yeah.
Ryan Davies is part, and so
Yeah. Yeah.
most of the people in the room weren't so happy with him as a but then this objection was raised to me in the question period, and the question was this thing. Well, what about this? Couldn't the fact that you suffer horrendous evil in this life be an advantage in the next life? And I initially put it down. I did put it down. And then the fellow that, again, his name's skipping me, who invited me, we had another Zoom meeting. And then he brought it up again. And this time he gave the example of Francis of Assisi, where he has the stigmata. Whoops. Yes.
Oops. We have some people that are going to be using this room in a few minutes.
Okay. Is there somewhere else I could go?
Yeah.
We can wrap up.
Okay. I'll just give you a few minutes. I'll be. So let me just put the point. So
Yeah.
And so there was they were treasuring the stigmata, and that made him like Jesus. Okay. Now I initially hadn't thought of this. I thought, well, this looks like an advantage of the afterlife, with advantage of horrendous suffering. And so there's what I finally figured out is, let's assume more assumptions here. We've got an incarnation and redemption, and now we're still raising the problem of evil for that. That's a lot for an atheist to allow the theist all this. But here's the problem. Oh, here's the problem. Jesus did, and this is, I think, standard and at least Catholic doctrine here. Jesus did not have to die and suffer all the way he did in order for us to be redeemed. Anything Jesus would have done would have been of infinite merit, any good act, to redeem us. I mean, this whole thing is all about offense to God, which is kind of tricky in a way because God isn't hurt by our offenses. He's perfect, so he can't be hurt, but he's offended. And so we're trying, and redemption is trying to make up for this offense to God. Okay, but anything Jesus did in this life could have been of infinite merit and then made up for the infinite offense. If it's infinite, it's not infinite because it's a trivial thing, maybe eating an apple, which was prohibited, but then it's still an offense. But because it's against God, it's an infinite offense. Well, now because Jesus is God, we have an infinite makeup, and so Jesus did not have to die on the cross. So, and then what would happen? So, what would happen? The Jesus who reincarnated would be something like Nelson Mandela. He didn't die by evil acts. He lived in this life. He did get in prison for a while. We could talk about Gandhi or somebody else, and we could then be like Jesus, who was like Nelson Mandela, and we could have camaraderie with Jesus in this life and in the next life. And so we don't need that horrendous suffering to fix up the redemption. It wasn't necessary, and so no longer an objection.
Well, I do have a response to that. I think, and I know we're running short on time, but one might argue that Jesus had to suffer the way he did in order for sin to be redeemed. He had to suffer horrendously, and that suffering includes, for many Christians, going into hell, a descent into hell.
Sure. Well, he goes down and brings people out of hell. That
right.
That didn't hurt him. Look, you got to remember, God, who was offended here, he didn't horrendously suffer from our offense. He didn't suffer at all. He was offended. So all we have to do is make up for it. It's an infinite offense. So Jesus, leading a good moral life, leading a Nelson Mandela type life, could have done a lot of good things. And it seemed like that would have been enough, given his infinite character, to make up for this, what we did, or what Adam and Eve did, which really couldn't have hurt God very much at all.
Well, except in light of God's wrath, and that Jesus satisfied God's wrath and couldn't just live a good life. He had to live a perfect life. And in order to be the perfect sacrifice that could quell God's wrath, which is his holy.
Look a little human here with wrath. That's a human emotion. I'm not sure how a spiritual being has wrath. When I think of wrath, I think of how it's physically expressed in the person. I'm not sure. Well, how mad could God be at Adam and Eve for disobeying? Look, it was kind of a pointless, at least the way it's printed. It wasn't clear why you can't eat from this tree. I mean, if God had said, "Don't kill Eve, Adam," and he kills Eve, then that starts to look like a good offense. But don't eat from. I mean, you think about children. Don't do this, and then they don't see any point to it, so they do it. I mean, it's not clear what the offense was so bad against God that he would be wrathful. It's all, look, the whole thing about the original sin, which actually Jews don't endorse, and Arabs don't, Islam is not endorsed either, is to make us all connected with an offense. If it was all our individual acts, then some people would do bad acts, we would all be in the same sinner category. But if there's an original sin by the first parents, then we're all cut. Now imagine, although we don't think that we're things that we're blameworthy for, things that our ancient ancestors did, just 5 generations back, 2 generations back, somehow on this theory, we're all implicated in this fence at the beginning of time. It's kind of hard to see the morality of all that, since in law, we don't have anything like that.
Well, and it's because God is completely other than law or human invention, which is law is a human invention. But the point would be to bring in God's holiness. God is a holy God. And even if he isn't wrathful like ad intra, wrath isn't a essential attribute. It is a response to sin. And even if you say, well, the Adam and Eve thing, that was just like a minor offense, disobedience to God. But in the context of Eden and the perfection, like actually seeing God and still choosing to do what's wrong, that is a major offense. And as a result, they're kicked out, and that trickles down into our DNA, into our biology. So God's holiness is a right response to that offense. And Christ had to live not just a good life, but a perfect life in order to be the perfect substitute and sacrifice to satisfy or quell God's righteous wrath, his righteous anger.
See,
and that
you're all building that into a theology there, which if you're trying to convince the outsider, you have to be talking about some normal sense of morality, and that it violates that normal sense. But the theology you're building is not a normal way of thinking that how could we have offended somebody so much and then be guilty for it for every generation thereafter. This is a lot of big assumptions. You put the assumptions all in there, you get the conclusion. But if you're trying to argue for it in a way to convince people who don't have this, even Arabs and Jews who are believing in God but don't have this whole story of redemption, it's a little hard sell. You got.
Well, the only reason I went there to the full scope is because you allowed the incarnation. Why did God even have to incarnate, right?
Yeah. Well, again.
I mean, that's why I then went a little further. But
he doesn't have to reincarnate either. On my understanding, on God, you think he logically had to? He could have forgiven us.
No, I didn't say logically had to, but I mean, if you're going to allow God came down to earth and became a man, but yet still remained fully divine and fully human, then we have to account for what the heck. And we have to go further into theology at that point to make sense of it. And my point is just that there is good theology that does make sense of it, why Christ had to suffer and die in the way he did and live the perfect life. And it wouldn't be good enough just to be a Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, I don't think you made that point, but that's, it doesn't ring very convincingly because I think actually what would happen there is there would be analogs of that would present things you wouldn't want to accept either. I mean, that's a little bit too the necessity of this death of Jesus. I mean, that is not in Catholic theology. I know that it was not necessary. God could have forgiven. They might put it this way: it was appropriate or maybe fitting. It's a nice thing to do. But it was absolutely necessary, had to suffer and die, or God could have not forgiven us? I mean, that can't be right. God could have forgiven us. Jesus, he didn't have to have this redemptive act of reincarnating. It was a way to do it, but it wasn't the only way that God could have done it. In theology, and any theology would not say it was absolutely necessary that God had to incarnate and die, or we could not have been forgiven. That's too strong. But anyway, we're off on way.
Okay.
Up.
I think, but I know you've got to go. That's interesting. We could keep talking about that. But last question is, so you'll have to forgive me. This is loose, but you can think about this, but my worry is that when we're talking about a just state, you've made a lot of analogy to a just state. Mm-hmm. I think one way of taking what you're suggesting on the two models, Richard's model versus your model, your model of the world more closely aligns with socialism, leveling the playing field. No, not exactly. Just hear me out. Richard's model more closely aligns with a capitalist or democratic type society where there's big winners, there's big losers. That's all I'm trying to get out of it. I'm not saying your view is socialist, but you would like to level the playing field more like a socialist society. Richard would like to allow for big winners and big losers because there's this great ceiling, this great good that you can get out of allowing for that range. Mm-hmm. And so wouldn't it be better on the whole to allow for big winners and big losers, as opposed to just having it be this sort of steady state where everyone sort of gets along and has equal opportunity for soul making, but then you get the sort of problems that come with a socialist type arrangement?
No, actually, I remember I'm a political philosopher before.
And I know I'm playing loose with things, but
as a political philosopher, my foundation is libertarianism. That's a pretty conservative ideal. My foundation is libertarianism, and my claim is that the libertarian foundation leads to welfare liberalism and leads to concern about equality in terms because if you're concerned about, I got to stick with the company.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.